Hey everybody, today we're talking about the vertebral column. And then we're also going to knock out the ribs and the sternum as well. So the vertebral column, which is of course your spine, your spinal column, which is going to support your head, support your other limbs, provide you with a lot of areas for muscle attachment. In the adult, the vertebral column is made out of 26 bones. So there are going to be 24 vertebrae, so 7 cervical vertebrae, 12 thoracic vertebrae, 5 lumbar vertebrae, 7, 12, 5, breakfast, lunch, dinner. And then there's also 2 bones made of fused vertebrae, a sacrum and a coccyx. So we're going to go over all of these guys. We're going to start by talking about a basic fundamental vertebra. And then we're going to look at how vertebrae differ in the neck, in the upper and lower backs. And then we're going to look at the sacrum and the coccyx. And we'll keep on going. So this is a very typical vertebra right here. This is a typical vertebra. The structures on a basic vertebra include the body. Remember, we've met a body on other bones before. Then we're going to have a vertebral arch, a vertebral foramen. Remember, a foramen is a hole. We're going to see some guys called pedicles, laminae, spinous processes, transverse processes, superior and inferior articular processes. Our processes are things that stick out. We're also going to meet some structures called facets. We're going to see some notches, some more holes, some more foramina, and some discs as well. So let's get started with all that. So on this vertebra, I have circled this body. This is the vertebral body right here. It is the main weight-bearing portion of the vertebra. It is the anterior part of the vertebra. So this is anterior, this is posterior back here. Now, coming off that body, we have a bony curve. That is called the vertebral arch. Extends posteriorly from the body. It is going to protect the spinal cord. The spinal cord is going to be in this space here. And the arch is made of 2 paired structures. We're going to meet them in a second. We're going to have 2 things called pedicles and 2 things called laminae. Before we get to those pedicles and laminae, let's look at this hole that we find between the body and the vertebral arch. This hole is called the vertebral foramen. Now, when we articulate, when we stack our vertebrae, collectively, all of these holes form the vertebral canal through which goes the spinal cord. Okay, remember we have this vertebral arch right here. The first part of the arch running from the body to this process going out laterally, this first part of the arch is called the pedicle. The word pedicle means little foot. And this is the pedicle. This would be another pedicle over here. So from body to this process here is the pedicle. And we've got 2, of course, 1 on each side. Our next part of the arch, between this process going laterally and this process going posteriorly, this part of the arch right here is called the lamina. So a lamina is a thin layer. The laminae are thinner than the pedicles. This is a lamina. This is a lamina over here. So 1, 2 laminae, 1, 2 pedicles. And collectively they make up that arch, which is going to protect that spinal cord, help form that vertebral foramen. All right, let's do some of these processes. The process going posteriorly is the spinous process. Very important site of muscle attachment here. This is the part that you can often see on people. You can see the little bumps of their spine. You can easily feel these spinous processes as well. Now, they're not the only process, though. I also have a pair of lateral ones. Each of these lateral processes is called a transverse process. So this is a transverse process here, and then we have another transverse process over here. Muscles are going to attach to them, ligaments are going to attach to them, and in thoracic vertebrae, they are going to articulate with a rib. So on each side, a rib is going to swoop in. So a rib is going to come in kind of like this on each side and articulate with that transverse process. But that only happens in thoracic ones. So in lumbar and cervical, these guys are used for muscle attachment. In thoracic ones, muscle attachment plus rib articulation. And more on that later on. So that's pretty much it for this superior view. What I want to do now is look at the vertebra from the side so I can pick out more things. And this is the side view of a nice vertebra right here. Drop that down a little bit. So I see my body over here. I see a pedicle right here. This is a transverse process coming out at you. This is the spinous process here. It's kind of hard to see the lamina. The lamina's in there. But what I also notice in this side view are processes going up and going down. The processes going up, so I got two of them here, one on each side. Each of these is a superior articular process. This is a superior articular process. It has a smooth region, which I'm going to circle right here, and you can't see the whole smooth region. That is called the superior articular facet. And what's going to happen, as we'll see in a second, is the superior articular facet on this vertebra is going to articulate with the inferior one on the vertebra above that. And that's going to help anchor the vertebrae. It's going to lock them together to give you more stability and support. Okay, so we got superior articular process going up, and there's a smooth region on it called the superior articular facet, and that's where we're going to articulate with the inferior version. So this is an inferior articular process down here. There is our inferior articular facet right there, and those are going to articulate. So the inferior is going to articulate with the superior above it. So if I were to draw another vertebra right here, I'm drawing the body, pedicle, and then here comes the superior articular facet like so. And then there's the spinous process, the inferior articular facet. There we go. Not too pretty, but this is what's going on. The superior one articulates with the inferior one. Their facets meet, and this is going to anchor the vertebrae together, which is really important for stability and for strength and support. So we want to limit vertebral movement. We don't want the vertebrae to move too much, so we articulate these superior and inferior articular processes. All right, let me test my artistic skill here. Boom, 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 boom. Bear with me here. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm not a great artist. What am I trying to draw? You're probably like, what in the heck is he trying to draw? Boom, 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 boom. What am I drawing? Anybody know? I am drawing a snake. That is a snake. That's its tongue right there. I don't know. But what I do know is that if we look at snake vertebrae, they don't have these. They're very tiny, like very flat. And what's that going to do to the mobility of the vertebral column in the snake? Well, it is going to allow the snake to be much more mobile. You know, it can really bend and twist because they don't have their vertebrae locked together. All right. Perfect. Perfect. Here I see vertebrae stacked together. So here's the body, of course, body. Here's some spinous processes here. And what I can tell is here is an inferior articular process right here. And that inferior articular process, I can see it articulating with this superior guy. I can see it happening here as well. I can see it happening here too. And this is going to lock those vertebrae together, which is super important for stability and for strength. All right. If I find the body of the vertebra, which is right here, and I find my inferior articular process, I see this little indentation here. This little indentation is called the inferior notch. Now, what's really cool is what happens when we stack the vertebrae together and we look at that same indentation. So here's that inferior notch right there. But now when I put a vertebra below it, it's less of a notch. It is more of a hole between vertebrae. And that hole between vertebrae is called the intervertebral foramen. And this is an exit point for spinal nerves. So spinal nerves will come out of here. Spinal nerves, of course, are attached to the spinal cord. And they're going to come out of the intervertebral foramina. All right, we're almost done the basic structures of a vertebra. I think this is the last one here. So I've got two bodies of vertebrae here, and the two bodies have a pad of fibrocartilage between them, and that pad of fibrocartilage is called an intervertebral disc. Very important in bearing weight and shock absorption as well. All right, so those are all my basic features. Now I want to look at my 7 cervical vertebrae. My 7 cervical vertebrae, my first 2 are unique. C1 is unique. C2 is unique. C1 is also called the atlas. C2 is called the axis. And then the other 5 are like regular cervical vertebrae. And we're going to see a pair of unique structures on those other regular cervical vertebrae, including some transverse foramina, as well as what's called a bifid spinous process. So this is a quote-unquote normal cervical vertebra. So C3 through C7 are going to be normal cervical vertebrae. I still have a body. I still have a transverse process coming out. I've got a spinous process in the back. I've got a pedicle here. I've got a lamina here. I've got a vertebral foramen. Couple unique things though. Notice how there is a hole in the transverse process. That hole is called a transverse foramen. There's one on each side. There will actually be blood vessels in here, a major artery and vein going up to take blood to and from your posterior brain. So that's a unique feature. Also notice that the spinous process here is split. And the word for split into 2 is what bifid means. And this just lets muscles grab on to both sides with a little bit more, get a little better attachment by having 2 sticky out pieces here. And my neck is really mobile, so I want that good attachment of muscles on both sides. Now, one other thing we notice, it's not written over here, but my superior articular processes and I see the facet here, are rather flat in my cervical vertebrae. Now, why does this make sense? I made a big point of talking about how the superior and inferior articular processes lock the vertebrae together to restrict movement. But in the neck, think about your neck. You can rotate, you can bend, you can twist, you can roll it. Your neck is rather movable, so it has more flat superior articular processes. And we're seeing the smooth face right here, which is the facet. So those are the unique structures of a typical cervical vertebra. But we also have two weird cervical vertebrae. This is C1, the first cervical vertebra. He is called the atlas. So we got a superior view of the atlas. We see his superior articular facet right here on each side. And these two spots articulate with the occipital bone. Remember, the occipital bone had these bumps next to the foramen magnum. Those bumps were called condyles. And that's where these guys articulate. And that's going to let you say yes. Now, this guy, the atlas C1, is also going to articulate with the vertebra below it, C2, or the axis. And this articulation, as we're going to see, is very much involved in the no motion. All right, so this is my atlas. You need to be able to recognize it as the atlas. You're going to know its two articulations and the two motions that it's capable of doing. Okay, let's look at some structures on this guy. So if I look at my atlas here, it doesn't have much of a body. I mean, instead it has what's called an anterior arch. It doesn't have much of a spinous process. It has a posterior arch, like the vertebral arch basically, which has a little bump on it. That little bump there is called the posterior tubercle. Muscles attached to it. We do have a vertebral foramen. We do have a transverse foramen because this is a cervical vertebra. We also have a vertebral foramen, of course, between the two arches. Now, this superior articular facet, this is going to articulate with the occipital condyle, which is where you are going to say the yes motion. Now, you might wonder, why is this guy called the atlas? Well, if you go back to your Greek mythology, there was this guy, this sort of demigod, this titan named Atlas, whose job it was to hold up the sky, to hold up the heavens. And the bone here holds up the skull. So there's the illusion that we've got going there. All right, so that is our atlas. This bone is the axis. It is more typical than the atlas. It has one weird structure, which you can probably already see. It's this sticky up thing here. This guy is going to articulate with the atlas above him, and that articulation is involved in the no motion. Inferiorly, he's going to articulate with our third cervical vertebra. So let's look at the structures on him. We got a spinous process. It's bifid. We got a body. We got that vertebral arch with the pedicle and the lamina. We got a transverse process here with its foramen. We got a superior articular facet on a rather flat superior articular process. But then we've also got this unique structure right here. This structure sticking up is called the dens. And the dens is going to form like the axle that the atlas rotates on. So the atlas is going to spin on this thing as you shake your head to say no. All right. Excellent. So we're done our two weird ones. We're done our regular one. We're done with cervical vertebrae. We're now going to look at thoracics. There are 12 thoracic vertebrae. We used a thoracic to go over all the typical structures. Now, remember, one of the unique things about thoracic vertebrae was they are going to articulate, they are going to form joints with ribs. So I'm going to have a bunch of smooth regions for the ribs. In fact, on each side, I'm going to have 3 extra facets for the ribs. I'm going to have a transverse costal facet, and then superior and inferior costal demifacets. Demifacets are smaller facets. If we think about a facet as being like a circle or an oval, a demifacet is more like a half circle. Costal, of course, you know that word. The word costal means rib related. So my unique structures on my thoracic vertebrae are 3 extra facets on each side to articulate with a rib. A rib is going to come in sort of like so. It's going to need spots to articulate on. All right, let's look at this thoracic vertebra from the side. So basic review, there's the body, there's the spinous process, there's the inferior articular process, which is kind of like fused to the spinous process, superior articular process up there, pedicle, transverse process. Notice how the spinous process points down, by the way. There's the inferior notch. But here's the unique thing. On the transverse process, sort of on the front of it, remember the body is in the front, there is a nice smooth face. And when you're in lab, don't grab a fake vertebra, find a real thoracic vertebra. The fake ones don't have the good smooth indentation here. Find the real one and touch this smooth transverse costal facet. This guy is going to articulate with a bump on a rib. So if I draw a rib, making it a little thicker than I wanted to, the rib is going to have a head and a bump. So there is my rib drawing right there. There's going to be a head right there. And then this is the bump. And that bump is called a tubercle. And so the tubercle of the rib articulates right here. If I'm going to jumping ahead. Here is a rib. Here is the transverse process. There is the tubercle. The tubercle articulates with that transverse process on its costal facet. All right. Not only do I have that transverse costal facet, I have a smaller facet called a demifacet here and another demifacet here. This is my superior costal demifacet. The head of the rib articulates here. And the head of the rib is going to come in and form a joint right here, while the tubercle forms a joint right here. So this is my superior costal demifacet. This is my inferior costal demifacet down here. Now I got 2 demifacets because, as we're going to see, the rib's head articulates with 2 vertebrae at once. Okay? So, transverse costal facet, superior, inferior costal demifacet. All of them are articulation sites. That's what facet is telling us. All of them are costal, which means they're for the ribs. And the transverse guy is for the tubercle of the rib, whereas the demifacets are for the head of the rib. Let's take a quick look at a rib, and then let's look at that articulation. So let's go ahead and do that. Here is a rib. Rib curve. This is the front of the rib here. It curves around to the back. There's a little bump back there called a tubercle. And then there is the head. Notice how the head has 2 facets of its own. And notice how the tubercle has a facet as well. The head has two facets because the head is going to articulate with two demifacets. The head's going to articulate with the superior of one vertebra and the inferior of another vertebra. Now here I see the rib coming around. The head is articulating with the superior costal demifacet here. The tubercle is articulating with that transverse costal facet in there. If I look at another picture, I see the same idea. Tubercle meeting transverse process. There's a transverse costal facet in there. And here's the head. It's meeting the superior costal demifacet. Now I'm actually going to jump ahead because there's another picture I want to show you. So I'm jumping ahead to, which one do I like best? I'm just there. I like this one. This one's solid. Look at this rib right here, okay? I want you to look at this rib right there, all right? So I see the head of the rib right there, right? And notice how the head of the rib is articulating with the body of this vertebra and the body of this vertebra. So the head of the rib is articulating with a superior costal demifacet right there and with an inferior costal demifacet right there. So the head, and we can see this happening on, it's not perfect because this is a skeleton that's been like bolted back together, but the whole point is the head of the rib articulates with two bodies, an inferior costal demifacet on this body and a superior one on that one. And then meanwhile, the tubercle of the rib, let's go back up, the tubercle of the rib is articulating with the transverse costal facet. All right, that's a lot, I know. Well aware. Okay, done with thoracic vertebrae. Let's do the lumbars. 5 lumbars, remember 7, 12, 5, breakfast, lunch, dinner. Lumbar vertebrae, they're big because they're supporting more weight, but they have no extra structures. Yay, that's good news. They got just all the normal stuff. They got the body, they got the pedicle, the lamina, the transverse process, the spinous process, the vertebral foramen. And if we rotate this guy from the side, we can see his lovely inferior articular process with its inferior articular facet. Whoopsie. His superior articular process, and the facet would be on the other side of this guy here. So, and there's that inferior notch. Perfect. I like thoracic, I have lumbar vertebrae. They look like a moose to me. I see a moose when I look at a thoracic vertebra. Like here is his snout, antlers. This is the thing that hangs down. It's called a dewlap. That is a moose right there. And just in case you want another animal, to me, I see a giraffe here. So the giraffe has that long snout that comes down, has those little horns, which are called ossicones, that come up. And it's got ears. I see a nice giraffe here. I don't know about the cervical. There's probably an animal that somebody thinks the cervical looks like. Anyhow, that's neither here nor there. We've done 24 vertebrae. We got 2 more to go, 2 more bones to go. This is a sacrum. It is a single bone resulting from the fusion of 5 initially separate sacral vertebrae. So usually you are in your mid-20s by the time this fusion is complete. And of course, fusion is going to create a stronger bone, which is good if we are trying to support weight. So, important structures we're going to see. We're going to have 3 important structures we're going to know, including the sacral foramina, the sacral promontory, and the auricular surfaces. Sacral foramina, 8 holes that we see here that are going to allow spinal nerves to exit the sacral canal, which is the space in the middle of it. Now this is the front view, anterior view here, and this is the superior part. This is where I would articulate with a lumbar vertebra, and this part juts out prominently anteriorly, and this is called the sacral promontory. Muscles attached here, ligaments attached here. It's an important obstetric landmark as well. Now, if I rotate the sacrum to the lateral view, I see this rough surface right here. This rough surface is called the auricular surface. The word auricular means ear-shaped or ear-like. And our hip bones have a corresponding auricular surface on this part of the hip bone called the iliac part. And we're creating a hip joint called the sacroiliac joint. If I look at an articulated pelvis here, I've got the sacrum in the back here, hip bone right here, hip bone right here. This is the iliac portion of the hip bone that flares up and out. And this joint right here is called the sacroiliac joint. And each of these bones has an ear-like surface called an auricular surface. Now, if we go back for a second, if I go back, let's go forward first. There we go. I notice the auricular surface is rather rough. The roughness creates a stronger connection between the two bones. So the roughness limits my movement, which is going to enhance the stability of this joint. All right, that's it for the sacrum. The final bone we've got down here is the coccyx, usually made of 3 fused vertebrae, but occasionally 4 or 5. Again, mid-20s by the time fusion is going to be complete. So muscles and ligaments do attach to this tailbone here. There would be a fibrocartilage disc between the coccyx and the sacrum. So there's a little bit of movement there, especially during childbirth, but also during pooping. That's the coccyx. And now we're done the vertebral column. Fantastic. So now I want to talk about the thoracic cage, which is going to have 12 thoracic vertebrae in the back, articulating with 12 pairs of ribs on each side, plus the sternum in the front. And between the ribs and the sternum, we have all this cartilage, which is called costal cartilage. Of course, this cage protects the heart, protects the lungs, and a lot of muscles are going to attach to these ribs, to the sternum. Okay. The ribs. There are 12 ribs on each side. The first 7 ribs are called true ribs because they all have their own piece of costal cartilage. The last 5 are false ribs because they're either sharing costal cartilage, like ribs 8, 9, and 10, or like ribs 11 and 12, they got no costal cartilage right at all. So my last 5 pairs are false. My last 2 are not only false, they're also said to be floating because they don't have any cartilage in the front. And all 12 articulate posteriorly with my thoracic vertebrae. We see the head of the rib here articulating with the 2 bodies of thoracic vertebrae. Looking at a rib, we did this earlier. We know we got a head of the rib. It's got 2 facets to articulate with the 2 bodies of 2 vertebrae. The bump on the rib is the tubercle of the rib. So that takes care of the ribs for us. Don't forget about the costal cartilage, connecting ribs 1 through 10 to the sternum. It's hyaline cartilage. I like having cartilage here in my thoracic cage because it gives me a degree of flexibility that I need for big, deep inspirations and expirations. All right, let's do the final bone of the day. The final bone of the day is the breastbone. We're not going to call it that anymore. It's called the sternum. The sternum protects the heart and the lungs. Muscles attached to it as well. And as you can see, there are 3 parts to it. There is a manubrium, a body, and a xiphoid process. The manubrium is the top portion. The word manubrium literally translates as handle. The manubrium, because someone thought this looked like an upside down dagger or short sword. The manubrium is going to articulate with the clavicles, the collarbones on each side, plus via the costal cartilage as it attaches to the first pair of ribs. So that is the manubrium. The big middle part is called the body. The body. Costal cartilages of ribs 2 through 7 come in here. As the body, muscles will attach here as well. The bottom part, the inferior projection, is called the xiphoid process. Xiphoid means sword-like. And this process comes down. Your ab muscles, your rectus abdominis, so your abs, they are going to attach to that xiphoid process. And that, folks, is this lab chapter on vertebrae, ribs, and the sternum. We are done. Hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully you stayed through the whole entire thing. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.